Great men are not born. They are forged by adversity. History's most towering figures didn't rise to greatness on a path of comfort. They were broken first, then rebuilt in fire. Victor Hugo, one of literature's most colossal minds, didn't just write about suffering, he lived it. Exiled for nearly 2 decades, hunted by political enemies, haunted by the death of his daughter, he transformed personal agony into immortal art. Les Misérables wasn't just a novel. It was a scream against injustice, a manifesto of resilience written by a man who knew oppression intimately. And that's the pattern, isn't it? Struggle isn't an obstacle to greatness. It's the crucible. Psychology confirms it. Hardship rewires the brain, sharpens focus, and breeds relentless determination. The most brilliant minds, Da Vinci, Beethoven, Hugo, weren't just talented, they were tempered by suffering. Comfort breeds complacency, but chaos forces reinvention. This isn't just inspiration, it's a dark, unspoken truth. The world doesn't reward the untested, it chews them up. But those who endure, they emerge as something else entirely. So let's pull back the curtain. This isn't about motivational platitudes, it's about understanding the mechanics of greatness. Why do some men collapse under pressure while others turn it into power? What separates the ordinary from the extraordinary? The answer lies in the struggle. And Victor Hugo's life? It's the perfect blueprint. Victor Hugo's story begins in chaos, a childhood ripped apart by war and divided loyalties. Born in 1802, he was caught between 2 extremes: his father, a hardened Napoleonic general, and his mother, a fierce royalist who despised the revolution. Imagine the tension in that household, love and ideology at war, the very air thick with conflict. This wasn't just family drama. It was a microcosm of France itself, a nation torn between rebellion and tradition. And Hugo? He wasn't just observing it, he was absorbing it. The boy who would later write Les Misérables was already learning that life isn't about black and white, but the brutal, beautiful shades of gray in between. Psychologists know this pattern well. The most resilient minds are often forged in unstable environments. When a child grows up navigating contradictions, they develop something rare: the ability to think critically under pressure. Hugo didn't just survive his fractured upbringing, he weaponized it. Every argument, every move between his parents' opposing worlds sharpened his perception. Adversity in childhood doesn't just build character, it rewires the brain, forcing adaptation, creativity, and an almost predatory awareness of human nature. That's the hidden advantage of a difficult start. It doesn't just make you stronger, it makes you see what others miss. And Hugo? He saw everything. Victor Hugo didn't just write about rebellion, he lived it. When Napoleon III seized power in a coup, Hugo didn't bow, he roared. Calling the emperor a traitor to France, he was exiled for nearly 20 years, cut off from his homeland, branded an enemy of the state. Most would break under that weight, but not Hugo. Instead, he turned banishment into his greatest weapon. Stripped of everything, he wrote Les Misérables, a novel so explosive in its demand for justice that it shook Europe. This wasn't just literature, it was revenge through genius. The brutal truth is that exile doesn't just test a man, it exposes him. Weak souls crumble in isolation, but the strong, they transform. Psychologists call it post-traumatic growth, the phenomenon where suffering doesn't just scar you, it forges you into something sharper. Hugo didn't waste his exile in self-pity. He used it to refine his vision, to channel his rage into art that would outlive empires. His suffering wasn't a setback. It was the fire that tempered his greatest work. Because that's the paradox of adversity. It doesn't just take, it gives. And what it gives to those who endure is the power to rewrite the world. Exile didn't silence Victor Hugo. It unleashed him. Stripped of his country, his comforts, even his voice in the political arena, he did the one thing tyrants never expect. He turned pain into power. Les Misérables wasn't just a story, it was a revolution in ink. Every page pulsed with the rage of the oppressed, the desperation of the forgotten, the fire of a man who refused to let suffering break him. Hugo didn't just write about justice, he weaponized his exile to demand it. And that's the secret psychology of sublimation, the alchemy of transforming raw, unfiltered anguish into something immortal. Pain, when left to fester, destroys, but when channeled, it becomes the fuel for genius. Hugo's isolation sharpened his vision, his grief gave his words weight, and his fury made them unforgettable. Great men don't just endure suffering, they harness it. They take the chaos inside and forge it into something the world can't ignore. Struggle doesn't just teach resilience, it creates urgency. A man with nothing left to lose becomes dangerous in the best way possible. And Hugo? He proved that the exiled, the broken, the ones pushed to the edge, they're the ones who change history. Not in spite of their pain, but because of it. The drowning of Leopoldine, Hugo's adored daughter, didn't just wound him. It split his life into before and after. A lesser man would have collapsed under that weight. But grief works differently on those destined for greatness. Instead of silencing him, it carved his soul deeper, sharpening his words into blades of sorrow and love. His poem, Tomorrow, at Dawn, isn't just verse. It's a raw, howling testament to loss, written by a man walking alone to her grave. And here's the chilling truth. The deepest pain often births the most enduring art. Psychologists have a name for this dark alchemy: creative transcendence. When ordinary minds shatter, extraordinary ones rearrange the pieces into something new. Hugo didn't escape his suffering. He let it remake him. Because here's the paradox they don't tell you. The people who feel the most agony leave behind the most light. Beethoven composed his masterpieces deaf. Van Gogh painted his visions while wrestling madness. And Hugo? He turned a father's endless grief into words that outlived empires. That's the final lesson of struggle. It's not about surviving the darkness. It's about learning to write in it. Victor Hugo returned to France not as a broken exile, but as a titan, his words now louder than the cannons that once chased him out. Even in his final years, he refused to shrink into silence, thundering against injustice until his last breath. And when he died, 2 million people flooded the streets of Paris, a sea of mourners stretching beyond sight. That wasn't just a funeral, it was proof. Proof that endurance isn't just survival, it's a seismic force that echoes across centuries. History doesn't remember the comfortable, it remembers the fighters, the ones who took their suffering and hammered it into something unbreakable. Psychologists call it stress-induced resilience, the phenomenon where relentless adversity doesn't weaken the mind, but tempers it into steel. Hugo's legacy wasn't built on talent alone. It was forged in exile, grief, and defiance. Because true immortality isn't given, it's seized by those who refuse to surrender. And the lesson? Simple. The world breaks everyone, but afterward some are strong at the broken places, and those are the ones who change everything. Victor Hugo's life wasn't a story of triumph despite suffering, it was triumph because of it. Every exile, every loss, every moment of despair was a chisel shaping him into the literary colossus the world remembers. And here's the truth they don't teach you. Your struggles aren't obstacles. They're the raw material of your legacy. Hardship doesn't just test you, it recreates you, forcing you to dig deeper, think sharper, and fight harder than you ever thought possible. When life breaks you, what will you build from the pieces? Will you collapse under the weight, or will you do what Hugo did? Turn pain into power, grief into greatness, and injustice into immortality. The world doesn't need more comfortable souls. It needs warriors of resilience. You will suffer. That's inevitable. But how you transform that suffering, that's your choice. So rise, create, fight. Let your struggles forge you into something unstoppable. Because the difference between ordinary and extraordinary isn't talent. It's the courage to burn your pain as fuel. Now, what will you do with yours?